How's it going, everybody? I hope you're doing well, and I hope that you're hanging in there. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about some of the common engagement strategies and tactics used by modern-day progressive activists to advance their goals and ideologies. This would include your LGBTQ and racial justice activists, it would include your feminist activists, it would also include groups like BLM and Antifa, and really any group or organization that's working to bring about cultural or systemic change. This also includes groups of people hired by non-governmental organizations working in lockstep with the aforementioned activist groups. All of these groups tend to use a fixed set of methods and strategies when engaging with the public, and it's those methods and strategies that I want to cover in this video. Maybe a few of you watching this will be familiar with Saul Alinsky's 1971 book, Rules for Radicals. Several of the tactics that I'll be describing in this video can fairly be described as modern-day internet-era adaptations of tactics that are listed in that book. Some of the information in this video comes from my personal experience dealing with activists over the past decade, and some of it comes from conversations that I've had with former activists themselves, including former feminists, former members of Antifa, who have fortunately been willing to have an open dialogue with me and discuss some of the tactics that are commonly employed by the groups that they used to belong to. Now, in order to understand these tactics and their purpose, a little bit of context is going to be necessary, and if you'd like to skip over the context, feel free to scroll to the timestamp. For everybody else, there's a cultural and social revolution taking place in much of the West right now, as I'm sure everybody watching this has probably noticed, spurred on in no small part by various groups of progressive activists. The revolution is centered around changing the fabric of society, transforming culture, and replacing the social norms and power structures that have traditionally defined Western society. There's a variety of causes being worked towards by these groups. For example, some of these groups are working to dismantle and replace capitalism. Some are working to dismantle what they call patriarchy, which is a bit of a misnomer and is an umbrella term that they use to denote male power, male identity, male headship, male-centric culture, masculinity, brotherhood and male solidarity, and numerous other related concepts. Other groups are working to dismantle whiteness or colonialism, which they equate with whiteness, and both of which are sort of code terms used to denote concepts like white hegemony, white culture, white solidarity, white-centric nepotism, and even white demographic majority, depending on the context. Some groups are waging a war against heteronormative culture and are trying to create a culture where homosexuality is regarded every bit as normal as heterosexuality. These groups often have goals and interests that overlap each other, and collectively they're working to promote and fulfill the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, and it's not uncommon to encounter them promoting narratives on climate change, for example, or anti-natalist narratives, or narratives related to more sustainable consumption and production. You'll frequently encounter them pushing veganism very heavily, for example. All in all, these groups believe that they're working to usher in a utopia of sorts. They believe that they're working to usher in a fairer, more equal, more equitable, and more inclusive world, a goal that they're working towards with religious fervor. They believe that all of their targets, so to speak, represent norms and structures that are outdated, oppressive, and even evil. They're at war with these things, and they believe that any measures they have to take to dismantle them are justified because in their minds they are fighting a war against evil. As I'm going through some of these tactics, you're going to be struck by how dishonest and morally bankrupt some of them are. The activists in question are well aware that these are dirty tactics, but you've heard it before, and as Saul Alinsky's book puts it, they believe that the ends justify the means. Now that we have the context out of the way, we'll begin diving into the tactics. The activists in question, among their various goals, are preoccupied with gaining control of the culture. They're working to establish cultural hegemony or cultural supremacy, and they want to create a culture that is centered around critical theorist values, also known as woke values. This is the ultimate end for them, and they believe that whoever controls the culture will rule society. They regard Western culture as having been traditionally defined by the opinions and the tastes of their targets, i.e. men, i.e. capitalists, and they believe that the culture created by these targets marginalizes other people. As a necessary measure, these activists want to capture and hold as much ground as possible. This includes our institutions, it includes the workplace, it includes our universities, and the culture at large, as already mentioned. They already have a major head start on this, since most companies, organizations, and institutions are being forced to push initiatives, woke initiatives, that align with the values of these activists, all of which is trickling down through these various entities from the UN themselves as part of their 2030 agenda for sustainable development. In such environments, these activists want people to conform totally to their values and ideologies, and they relentlessly police those around them to make sure that conformity is maintained. They also work to create a culture of fear to discourage others from speaking out or expressing an opinion that runs counter to their own, and they use their position in the workplace and elsewhere to deprive opportunities and upward mobility from any dissenters. These activists also use their position in the workplace to reward and give upward mobility to their allies or anyone else who signals allegiance to their ideology. In addition to cultivating such hegemony, they also work to cultivate and maintain solidarity among active participants, and the chief devotees typically have all of the loyalty of gang members. In the meantime, they work to make sure that their political opponents never establish solidarity for themselves, so that no culture of resistance or political mobilization can occur among their opponents. One of the various ways they work to achieve this is by sending one or more of their own to infiltrate the spaces of their opponents. These agents, so to speak, will often pose as members of the opposition in order to gain entry into the groups and spaces of the opposition. Once inside, they work to sow confusion, discord, and misdirection, and they otherwise work to control the dialogue of the group itself. They work to ensure that their opponents never have any exclusive spaces to themselves, typically by invading any spaces that they do form, and they go out of their way to heavily discourage their opponents from forming any such spaces. It's not uncommon to find these activists accusing their opponents of hiding in echo chambers, for example, even though they do the same thing and they do it consciously. As these activists continue to gain ground in our society, and as their values slowly become more hegemonic, whenever they do encounter an opinion expressed by the opposition, they work to keep it suppressed and quarantined so that it will not be able to spread to others and influence them. To this end, a common tactic that they employ is jumping ahead of the curve to frame their own values as the normal standard. They frame their own values as authoritative while framing their opposition's values as fringe. You'll often see these activists make statements like, "We need to heal the division in America, we need to embrace unity and put aside our differences, and the opposition needs to let go of these crazy ideas that they believe in." They're very proactive about challenging and ridiculing any expression made by the opposition while simultaneously working fervently to normalize their own values in the culture. They have a particular infatuation with reaching out to the young and shaping their view of normalcy. They believe that if they can influence the youth in their formative years and can shape their view of normalcy, that the young will eventually grow up to physically be the change that these activists wish to see manifest in the world. This is a sentiment that you'll see reflected very frequently in feminist theory and queer theory literature. Now that we have the general scope of their agenda out of the way, we'll begin to dive deeper into the specific tactics they use to shut down their opposition. There have long since been policies present in the workplace and elsewhere that prohibit sexism, racism, discrimination, and things of that nature, and all of these things, even outside of the workplace, have become culturally taboo. These things have become so frowned upon, in fact, that for most employers, if they receive notice that one of their employees is guilty of one of these behaviors, they will typically wish to cut ties with him or her in order to protect their brand, as they should. This is a major dynamic that these groups of activists tend to exploit, and they tend to frame any opinion that runs counter to their own as either racist or sexist or homophobic, etc. This enables them to attack the reputation and livelihood of their opponents, and this is their most commonly used tactic by far. In most cases, when they encounter a person who's promoting ideologies that run counter to their own, they will work to dig up personal information on that person, including the name of the person's employer. They work to dig up as much personal information on the person as they can, in fact, and if they happen to find the person's phone number or place of address, they love to make this information public, which is a tactic I'm sure you're all familiar with, known as doxing. If they encounter their opponent in the digital space, they tend to visit that person's page and strategically curate a collection of screenshots. Once they have these materials, the next step is to contact human resources of the person's employer. In most cases, if they don't actually succeed in getting their opponent fired from their job, they will usually then begin attacking that person's employer and trying to smear the employer's reputation, telling the world this employer doesn't mind hiring a racist or a sexist or a homophobe, etc. These activists often go around actively searching for targets, and during the George Floyd protests, for example, it was fairly common for them to target the social media pages of police officers and scan the profiles, trying to find anything that could be framed as racist. If they happen to find anything that could remotely be framed as racist, they would then use those materials to begin smearing the reputations of the police officers. And I actually have a couple of screenshots I'm going to share with you guys that a friend shared with me that she took in a Facebook group where these sorts of activities were being coordinated. These people try to attack the livelihood of their opponents in any way that they can, and if they're not able to reach out to their opponent's employer, they will often begin trying to dig up information on their opponent's family members and try to smear their reputations. The proliferation of this behavior in Western society has come to be known as cancel culture, and I want to point out that cancel culture, so to speak, is really a large-scale form of operant conditioning in that it is a form of reward or punishment-based behavioral training. If you promote the values of the activists, you are rewarded, often with upward mobility and other such things, but if you speak out against their values and ideologies, you are punished severely, often by having your livelihood attacked. And thus, by means of such behavioral reinforcement, the public capitulates more and more to the demands of the mob. The next tactic we're going to explore is the use of the weaponized false accusation. Within the past decade, weaponized false accusations have become an extremely common tactic among progressive activists used to silence their opposition. Not only do they use this tactic to silence their opposition, but it's often used as a power move to strip their designated targets of power. As a matter of fact, the Me Too movement itself was a power grab disguised as a reckoning against perverts in high places, unbeknownst to the majority of the public, even to this day. Now, there were real perverts who were taken down during the Me Too era, and not all of the accusations against men during that time were false, but the perverts were not the true incentive of the movement itself. The movement was primarily intended to strip powerful men of their influence and to dismantle patriarchy. During the height of Me Too, it was not uncommon to encounter prominent women saying this quiet part out loud. Take these two tweets from film writer and former Teen Vogue columnist Emily Linden, for example. The truth is, if there never had been a futurist female agenda, then there never would have been a Me Too movement, and dysfunctional aspiring actresses would still happily be going to the casting couch to lay down with perverts like Harvey Weinstein to this very day. From late 2017 until roughly 2019, the weaponized false accusation was an extremely common tactic, but after about 2019 its use began to decline, and it's now used only when absolutely necessary due to the heat that it brings to the progressive collective every time it's used. In the meantime, the so-called whisper networks that were developed by feminist activists during the height of the Me Too era are still in use today, but are no longer used for the purpose that they were originally created for. Instead, they are now used to identify men and women who have broken away from the ideology. And speaking of whisper networks, now I'd like to talk a little bit about progressive activism in the digital realm. For starters, progressive activists tend to be intensely private individuals while online, and they plan and coordinate pretty much all of their activities in private digital spaces, including private Discord servers, private Facebook groups, and sometimes even dedicated mobile apps. As a matter of fact, every major social initiative, call to action, and demonstration from the past decade, from the women's marches to the George Floyd riots, were planned and coordinated in private digital spaces. Some of these online activists are paid influencers, generally hired at the behest of various organizations or NGOs. But most of them are doing it of their own free will to help advance the ideologies that they're religiously devoted to. Some of their common goals in the digital realm are shaping the beliefs of the public, planning and coordinating activities, smearing their opponents, and compiling personal information on their opponents. Their most central goal by far is in shaping the beliefs and perceptions of other social media users, often by any means necessary. Their chiefest preoccupation is with winning people over to their ideology and influencing them to adopt their values. Whenever they're performing the dirty jobs online, like smearing or harassing their opponents, they often have dedicated fake profiles created specifically for that purpose, and they're very particular about these fake profiles. They don't use personal photos that can link back to them in any way. They don't use their real name. They use a unique email address, and they work to keep everything compartmentalized. They're very big on compartmentalization. They almost always work together as a team, but they work to maintain the illusion that they are not together. They're also notorious for making fake social media accounts to pose as conservatives or Christians or men's rights advocates or really any other targeted group. With such accounts, they often make false statements or even entire fabricated narratives to deceive, manipulate, and misdirect people. For example, they might fabricate a story about how they escaped from a Christian cult in order to deter any would-be Christian converts. They also use these special fake profiles to sow discord or to otherwise tarnish the reputations of targeted groups. For example, they might pose as a conservative online and begin leaving violent or racist comments on public posts to tarnish the reputation of conservatives. They also sometimes use such profiles to promote absurd conspiracy theories, hoping that members of targeted groups will publicly endorse those theories and thereby harm their own credibility. They also tend to utilize these special fake profiles to join discussions and to misdirect those who are having the discussion. A common smear strategy used by progressive activists in the digital realm is the utilization of so-called tag groups to mobilize their fellow activists onto the pages and channels of their opponents. They will often select a post or a video from the opponent's page and will share it inside of a private tag group or a private Discord server. From here, a mob of activists will begin flooding that person's page or channel and will begin attacking them. If it's a personal page, like a Facebook page for example, they will often go through the user's posts, laugh reacting at everything and leaving nasty comments, and accusing the user of being racist or homophobic or misogynistic, etc. If it's a well-known page or channel, however, they often choose their tactics a little more carefully. Usually, a select few activists will compose carefully articulated comments attacking the user's viewpoints. The rest of the group will then respond positively to these comments, giving them a like. The whole idea is to create the illusion among bystanders that the opinion of the activist overshadows the opinion of the original poster. In other words, they use the power of the mob to inflate the rating of the remark. They will often misdirect during such an event. For example, if they swarm a popular post or a popular video, they will often go out of their way to leave remarks like, "I can't believe this garbage was recommended to me in my feed." This serves two main purposes. It throws the target off their trail, but it also gives the target the false impression that the reaction to their content is impartial and representative. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about manipulation tactics that progressives employ inside and outside of the digital realm. As already mentioned, a chief priority among progressive activists is to smear their opponents any way that they can. Apart from attempting to label you as a bigot, if they're able to blackmail you, they almost always will, and they often try to set up situations to trap you so that they can produce the means to blackmail you. If they're not able to take you down, they will often try to reach out to those around you and shape their perceptions of you, even reaching out to family members. Another common strategy that they employ is accusing their opponents of that which they themselves are guilty of, and some people refer to this as projection, but that's a bit of a misnomer. Not only do they accuse their opponents of that which they themselves are guilty of, but they also project to misdirect. For example, you'll often see progressives using expressions like "stop the hate," even though they themselves have a seething hatred for their opponents. Another good example is the war that feminists launched on toxic masculinity in the mid-2010s. As feminists launched this attack, they simultaneously assured the American public that there was a war on women taking place. This was a preemptive measure on their part to sow confusion, but to also redirect any support and sympathy that would be channeled towards men back towards themselves. This projection tactic has numerous applications, and it's the primary means whereby progressive activists hurl dirt into people's eyes. These progressive activists are also very keen on enticing you to debate with them simply to wear down your endurance. The way they see it, the more energy they can get you to waste by arguing with them, the less energy you'll have for cultivating unity with like-minded people and for actually doing something productive. During discussions or debates, they often gaslight their opponent in various ways, but they're usually very careful to take the perception of bystanders into consideration anytime they do gaslight their opponents. Not only do they invariably frame their opponent's views as flawed, but they're also careful to frame the parameters and the rules of the discussion and to force their opponent to adhere to them. And if their opponent is able to roll with such punches, that's when they start moving the goalposts around. They are always keen on identifying their political opponent's exact political affiliation. They always want to know if their opponent is a Christian or a conservative, etc. This enables them to essentially bind and exhaust their opponent by rigorously holding them to the standard of their own moral code. Usually, after an activist has positively identified their opponent's religious or political affiliation, they will then try to entice their opponent to transgress their own moral code so that they can mock them in front of bystanders. If they're not able to successfully entice their opponent, they will often falsely accuse their opponent of transgressing anyway. Because activists are prone to engage in this behavior, they are likewise prone to be vague about their own political affiliation so that they cannot be held to any standard. They also try to take away their opponent's ability to define their argument and to define who they are and what they represent. They will often try to tie their opponent to a specific movement or ideology so that bystanders will associate that person with that movement or ideology. For example, in my work exposing fourth wave feminist activism, I've often been accused of being associated with certain movements. The central aim of the activist in this case is to cause bystanders to associate my findings with those movements and with whatever reputations are associated with those movements. Now, this video has been a breakdown of some of the more common tactics employed by progressive activists today. The question is, how do you deal with this? Here's what works for me. The best strategy for dealing with these people is getting them out of your spaces. When you identify a person who clearly belongs to an activist group and who is there to agitate, sow confusion, and sow discord, the best solution is always to remove them from the group. If you're in a digital space, block them. Let me be totally clear. I'm not telling you guys to go around blocking people that you disagree with, but when you have reasonable suspicion that somebody is an activist and they are there causing trouble, you are perfectly justified in removing them from the space. I realize that a lot of you guys are very adamant on free speech and you might have a personal issue with that, but I want to remind you that you're not dealing with people who play by the rules that you and I play by. I'm personally very opposed to censorship, but you have to understand these activists, they don't see anything in that. They don't see it as honorable. They don't see it as anything other than an opportunity to manipulate you. Just as an artist is passionate about painting and a builder is passionate about building, these people are passionate about tearing stuff down. It is their passion. These people aren't interested in dialogue. The only thing they're interested in is finding a way to get you to capitulate to their worldview. Another thing to keep in mind, if you find that your page has been swarmed by activists, you always need to remember that their efforts are meant to cause you to voluntarily silence yourself through the fear of ridicule. Whatever you do, don't censor yourself and don't limit your own visibility because that's what they want you to do. You must always bear in mind these people feed on the good faith of their opponent. They feed on their opponent's willingness to have a debate and a discussion. Don't waste your time arguing with these people. Instead, use your time wisely. Use your time linking up with like-minded people. They're going to accuse you of clinging to an echo chamber, but keep in mind, these people belong to private groups that unless you adhere to their ideology, you're not even allowed to know about them. Spend your time cultivating solidarity among your peers and working to mobilize. That's what these activists fear. With all of that out of the way, I want to give a special shout out to Tad Turner, Rob Baer, Chenny Randazzo, Rachel Merle, Robert Hodge, and Laquan Stone. Thank you guys for everything that you do and for fighting the good fight. That's all I got for this one. I hope you all stay safe. I'll see you in the next one. God bless you. And Let It Bleed by the Rolling Stones is a fantastic album from start to finish. You should all check it out. Until next time.